A very warm welcome to today's Keynote conversation with one of the UK's most successful journalists, authors and broadcasters, Sathnam Sanghera. His plaudits are way too many to list here. This week's was to make the shortlist for the Parliamentary Book Awards for Empireland, his latest bestseller. And that's no mean feat, as his sharp analysis and critical thinking challenges our history, our culture and the way we behave to each other. Sathnam is one of the men of the next 25 years, according to the writer Jonathan Coe. Whether he's writing autobiography or fiction, he is busy carving out his own literary niche in the multicultural Midlands, which he explores with incredible grace, generosity and humour. And what's more, he's from the same city as me, Wolverhampton. Hello, Sathnam.
Hello, Lynn.
So Sathnam, when did you know that you had a voice and that you wanted to be a writer?
Well, like a lot of writers, I started by winning a competition. And it was a writing competition set up by Michael Jackson's Heal the World charity. And we had to write an essay on how to heal the world. And it was run in conjunction with Radio 1. And my brother was a big Michael Jackson fan, told me to enter. I entered it and then I won. And the prize was to go to Los Angeles and see Michael Jackson perform at the Super Bowl, which I did. And then I came back to Britain and my local paper, your paper, the Express and Star, asked me to write about it. And that's when I started.
So how old were you then?
15.
Wow, to make that journey and see Michael Jackson and make the Midland News Association's best paper, that was something. So did that kind of, what did that do to you? Did that make you feel fantastic?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my background, the key thing is that, my father's illiterate. And my mum at that time didn't speak English and we had no books in the house. So that was the big thing. Just the idea of writing and being paid for it was way beyond our collective experience. So yeah, it was an unusual ambition and I still feel really surprised that I made it.
And what was your conclusion then?
I've actually burnt my entry and all evidence that I ever entered that competition because it was so embarrassing.
Yeah, but it might be in the archives of the Midland News Association,
Let's hope no one finds it, man.
Okay. So, but did that really spur you on then to think, I'm going to study English literature and take the steps forward?
Yeah, I mean, before that I was really good at maths. It seems to be an Indian thing. And I wanted to be an accountant. I guess because the most successful person in my family was an accountant. And you can only dream as far as your role models go. But then I met some journalists and some radio producers as a result of that competition. Then I started thinking, oh, maybe I could work in radio or maybe I could be a journalist.
So from school to Cambridge, and that was a huge step and a very different experience from growing up in Wolverhampton. Yeah,
I was the first person in my huge family to go to university. And it was really difficult, actually. I was full of guilt and I felt really homesick. It was a very difficult process. And now my parents feel bad that they made me feel so bad about leaving. But it's often the way for the first kid to do that. But it was the making of me to leave.
But what was it like at Cambridge?
It was quite weird. I think I found it quite strange to come from a background where we were poor and we pretended we were richer than we were, to go into an environment where people were quite rich and pretending to be poor, because that was the cool thing to do. And I didn't really understand a lot of the social rules of the upper middle classes, the whole thing about not looking like you tried very hard, but then doing well anyway. Whereas if you come from an immigrant family, you work really hard and you talk about how hard you've worked, And it took me a long time to really kind of, translate all those rules. Academically, really interesting.
It's difficult, isn't it? Because I was always, I come from a working class family and I was always told that if you have a good coat, it will take you anywhere. And it is exactly what you're saying, isn't it? That actually you need to be your best and look your best and the outside world needs to see you being your best. But there is a flip side to that in some social structures, isn't there?
Yeah, I guess in the media, which is full of people from the upper middle classes, it's okay to look really scruffy. Some of the most successful editors I've ever worked with have been slightly Boris Johnson-esque with their shirts hanging out of their shorts, out of their back of their trousers. And I was always really well dressed because that's what you do when you're working class. You put your best foot forward. So it took me a long time to get my head around all that weirdness.
So you knew you wanted to write, Sathnam. Did you think about journalism, or were you thinking about books and being an author then, or had you not made your mind up?
No, books were beyond my imagination, to be honest. And especially when you study literature, I felt like Cambridge gave me the idea that books were written by superhuman people who weren't me. Also white people, because I didn't study any brown people, I think, until the final term of my degree. So, yeah, it was a very gradual kind of ambition. So I wanted to be a news reporter, basically. And when I became a news reporter, I wanted to be a feature writer, and then I wanted to be a columnist, and then it was someone else saying, look, you should write a book. And they had to hold my hand through the entire 3-year process while I wrote my memoir. Because I didn't feel like I had a memoir in me. I didn't think I was ready to write one at the age of 28, and it seemed a bit presumptuous, really.
But what a memoir. What a memoir. The Boy with the Top Knot then became a television drama, a hugely successful television drama, and I understand now he's been adapted for the stage in Birmingham. Is that right?
Actually, it's my novel that's been adapted for the stage.
Ah.
But yeah, it was on TV, and yeah, crazy experience, really. You know, I think no one grows up thinking their life is interesting to other people, and it was my editor who every week said, "No, this is really unusual. This is really interesting," and actually, for me, it was a perfect experience in terms of the book and the TV thing. In that, I didn't fall out with my family. I didn't offend them. If anything, it brought us closer together. And it was something that really helped people from a similar background, people who suffered from severe mental illness, like my father and my sister. And there was almost nothing negative about that experience. And I've never met a memoirist who says that something usually goes wrong. So
how do you think you made nothing go wrong? What is it? Is that about the style of your writing? Is it about your candour? What is it, do you think?
I think I'm just incredibly careful. I think I checked everything, and also I ran it past each member of my family, and I didn't want to put in anything that upset them. I just thought I wanted it to be an act of love. So it was quite difficult. My sister asked for me to delete a whole chapter, which at the time really hurt me because it was a lot of work, and it changed the book. But I'm so glad I did it, because now we've got some privacy. And there's a temptation when you write a memoir that you put everything into it. And actually, it's important for your own sanity to hold something back. So I'm glad you did that.
But it is incredibly honest. I mean, it's interesting you say you held things back, because it's very, very honest. In a way.
How do you know that? People always say that. How do you know? Well, it is honest, but it's not entirely revelatory in that I don't tell you everything. I tell you quite a lot.
Well, you seem to share an enormous amount more than many other people would have done.
Yeah, more than most Indian families too. Because when I was writing it, I was trying to find examples of Indian family memoirs, and I could find almost none. It's a Western form, really. Indian families in general like to put the best image of their family forwards. They don't talk about mental illness and poverty and abuse and domestic abuse and so on. So it was quite a challenging thing to do within my community.
Well, I think few families really share that kind of stuff. I mean, lots of families are buttoned up, aren't they? And but sharing it is so important, and for other people going through those experiences. Was that part of your thought process?
Yeah, and actually it was my mum's thought process too, in that she felt very alone going through all those horrendous experiences, and she thought, it'd be good to share it and help people. And mental illness is a taboo in the West. But severe mental illness is such a profound taboo in Indian communities. I mean, if you get severe mental illness in India, in the Punjab where my family are from, you're generally locked up and you get no treatment. And so talking about it was quite a radical thing to do.
So tell me a little bit about, okay, so it was a huge success as a book. Lots of people loved it, got great reviews. So how did it then become a television series, and what was that like? Because you've gone from the printed word and then to words and pictures and other people delivering your words. What was that like?
It was a very surreal and very long process. People sometimes think one thing led to another quickly. It didn't. It was with one production company, and then actually my sister got very ill, and then I suddenly didn't want the attention. And then I just hoped it went away. And then it came back suddenly. Another Nisha Party rediscovered it about 7 years later, and it was, I think, almost 10 years after I wrote it when it came out, which is quite a surreal experience for me because the person on screen is not who I am now. You know what I mean? It's 10 years ago. And actually that makes it much easier. It made it much more palatable for my family and me because we could always just say, look, that was historic. We're different people now with different problems. But it was a very strange experience to have a third party put the most painful things you went through on screen. And I found myself just keeping my distance from the whole thing. I didn't read the script until a week before production because I just thought it had to be his own thing. I wanted to minimize the pain I felt. And I found it very emotional watching it and watching it being rehearsed and so on. But I think they did a great job and there was almost nothing that worried me about it or I felt they did wrong. They got the spirit of it right.
So you didn't read the script? I'm amazed. I would have thought that you'd have been much more involved in the script as a writer, wanting to protect your words and the way that you'd put them together. I
did it at a very late stage. And also it's partly because, as you know, as a writer, very few things ever get made. So I just assumed it was going to, fail at some point. So I felt there's I wanted to kind of protect myself from the disappointment of it not being made, which is what normally happens when you get your book optioned, frankly.
So you've gone on to develop a career in broadcasting, and we'll come to that in more detail at the moment. But did that kind of whet your appetite for it, for seeing your work on screen or being involved or thinking about being involved in television?
I think I am, first and foremost, a writer. And you can say so many things in a book. You can say 40,000 things in a book. You can say much fewer things on TV. But you reach a much bigger audience. So there's a bit of a paradox there. I think writing is always the thing I want to do, but sometimes TV is the best way of getting attention for your writing. So I feel like the two things are linked, and I try not to get emotionally invested in the TV, because the way I see TV is that there's a lot of meetings and very little happens. Whereas in writing, there's very few meetings and too much happens. It's very easy to write an article or a book. I mean, it's just you, isn't it? Whereas in TV, there's so many people involved. It's so expensive, and there's a lot of talking, isn't there, really? So I try not to get emotionally involved in anything. And if something happens, it's a surprise and a bonus.
But it makes a huge impact, and indeed that is what Empire State of Mind did and continues to do. But before we talk about how that series was made, because there's lots to talk about that, let's just talk about the book. When did you begin writing the book? The research is extraordinary in that book. So how long did it take you from when you thought, right, that's what I'm going to write about, to actually handing it to your agent or handing it to the first script editor?
I think it was 3 or 4 years of research and thinking about it. One of the most important events was making a Channel 4 documentary about Jallianwala Bagh, the massacre that happened about 100 years ago. And it was going to India that made me realise I knew almost nothing about Empire. And yet Empire explained almost everything about me. The reason my family were in Britain, the Sikh identity had been shaped by British imperialists, the Jallianwala Bagh, massive event in Sikh history and also imperial history. And yet I knew almost nothing. So I began to just read books for my own benefit, to just fill the massive gaps in my knowledge, and that slowly led to the idea of a book.
So you were writing the book, what, in the evenings and at weekends, because you were you still are, but you were a jobbing journalist. That's what you were doing every day.
I tend to do a few days of journalism and a few days of books, and it changes, and then I sometimes quit my column for a while, and then I do a book full time. It's quite a complicated process, but by the end I did about a year full time on the book to get it finished. It helped that there was a pandemic and there was nothing else to do. And my nieces had moved in with me, so I couldn't even watch TV. So I finished the book earlier than I was meant to.
Your very beautiful nieces, which appear in the television series as well, but we'll get to that in a minute. So the book came out, huge critical acclaim. It's an extraordinary book for many, many reasons. The thing that really strikes me about it is actually the lightness of touch in which you deal with very, very difficult concepts and consequences. And that's something about your writing which I think is really individual. Is that something deliberate? Do you choose to try and find a tone which is quite light? It's not that it's not serious, and it's not that it's not scholarly, but there is a particular style.
Yeah, I think it takes years to develop a style. I used to see it as a character failing, that whatever I was writing about, whether it was serious stuff at the Financial Times or schizophrenia in my memoir, I always felt a tendency to make jokes. And it took me 20 years to realise that actually that is an advantage, actually, and not many people can do it. And actually, you bring people in. I think most people don't want to pick up a book about schizophrenia. They don't want to pick up a book about massacres in Empire, do they? But if you make it palatable, if you use your own story as a way in, then actually it can be really powerful. And it was doing the memoir, which was very personal, and then doing quite a lot of first-person articles that made me realise the power of your individual story to kind of bring people into really complicated, difficult issues.
And I think people believe you more when you put it through your own personal experience, don't they? I mean, they actually believe you more, and I think they open their ears more to what you're saying.
It took me a long time to unlearn that, and I know a lot of academics will be watching this. Everything about academia is about taking yourself out. Everything about Financial Times journalism is about reducing yourself. You never say we or I. And so I had to unlearn all of that. And I realised that whenever I did write about myself, but use my own life as a prism through which to talk about serious things, you can just seduce so many more people than if you don't.
And very seduced we have been. So the book's completed. Did you always know that you were going to make the series? Was that, had somebody started talking to you about that?
I was talking about series at the same time as writing it.
Okay.
And I wanted to do it because of the documentary I'd done already.
Yeah.
But it just wasn't commissioned until after the book came out. Because of the pandemic, a lot of uncertainty in TV, Channel 4 had a lot of uncertainty about its income, and so it didn't get commissioned until very late.
Okay. Made through the wonderful Sandpaper Films, fantastic company that make really good history docs among many other things. But how do you go about condensing, subbing that work into a documentary series?
I don't know, but there were a lot of people involved, thank God. And we also really massively overfilmed. I mean, Helen, the director, really put her heart and soul in it. I think we all did it not for money, we did it because we really cared about the issues. And we think if Britain understands these issues, it's going to be a better country. So I feel like it was a labour of love for all of us, and we overworked, and it was worth it. I think they did a really good job.
It's a great series. Did you script it first? I mean, because in some ways it's like a long essay, isn't it? It's a pictorial essay. I mean, it's much more sophisticated than that. But it is. So did you script it first? Did you script it all? Did you do that in conjunction?
No, it was. I guess the directors and the producers took the book, took certain themes, and I kind of did things. And so I met people, put myself in certain situations, because again, I think the journey is really important for TV. I think another thing academics struggle with nowadays is the idea of history documentaries. They have this idea of this kind of Simon Sharma kind of thing, someone talking to cameras, giving a load of facts. And I feel like those things aren't really made nowadays. People want more, they want journeys, they want to feel emotionally connected, which is something I think historians can struggle with, because again, everything they've learned is about taking themselves out of the story. But so I guess I was put into situations which related to the book, and I learned things that I learned things that I'd not even written about in the book. So even though I knew a lot, it was still a journey for me.
So I'm sure there'll be some historians in the audience, some academic historians in the audience today, and I think one of the things that you really learn from watching Empire State of Mind is the power of archive. There is some fabulous archive for all the right reasons and all the wrong reasons, but nevertheless incredibly powerful archive. How much had you seen of that?
Yeah, I mean, I do think the archive was the best thing about it, and it made me realise that if we'd had phone cameras, Empire wouldn't have happened, you know, and you saw what happened with George Floyd, you know, and just to see a bit of footage of British officers beating up Indians was so powerful because it was all deliberately destroyed, or the films were never made. And you could just imagine how many things went unobserved. And it reminds you also how slow the news was in those days. Something would happen in India, and it sometimes takes 6 months before the full facts became evidence in London. And that's part of the reason why colonialism thrived for so long.
And do you think there's more archive out there to be mined and found?
I think there is, perhaps not in the official archives as much as in people's personal archives. I think families have got a lot of stuff in their attics in form of diaries and photographs and film, and it would be great to find ways of accessing that, because I think it can really change people's minds about everything. You know, it really brings it home emotionally and intellectually as well.
Yeah, no, it does. It absolutely does. And so the real power of it is it's your personal story and your willingness to be honest about your own situation and your family's situation. It's this wonderful archive, and it's this humour. It's a really heady mixture. And I'm again just thinking about our audience of academics, and academics do some amazing work and have some amazing research, but sometimes to translate that research into broadcast television is incredibly difficult, as you've just said. What advice might you have for them to think about their research and the things that they've discovered? What advice would you have for them to be able to sell their story ideas?
I think the main thing is that academia is intellectual, and it's about the thoughts in people's heads, whereas TV is not intellectual. What you're saying on screen is only, I'd say, 20%. What you look like, where you are, your emotional journey, those are things that matter much more to the viewer. And some academics are really allergic to those things, but they matter. And I feel like the academics that do best on TV are the ones who realise it's also a visual and emotional medium. And that doesn't make the academic work any less valuable. It just means you're reaching more people. And I think you've got to be willing to compromise in terms of, what you're saying and how you're willing to present it.
And you, that's very good advice. You strongly believe that, that history is argument, isn't it? You've said that. I've heard you say that many, many times. Do you think our audience would agree with you?
I think most professional historians know that history is argument. The problem is we now have this popular idea put about by our government that actually history is a list of facts. And if you pull down a statue, you're deleting history. And it's just not true. So I think historians are in a particularly difficult place at the moment, in that they are being, victimized by the government. They're at the center of a culture war, and they've been ridiculed, and their profession is being disrespected. And it's particularly depressing, given the politicians who are doing it, Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg, are themselves historians. They write history books. So they should know this basic thing, that history is argument. So I think we're in a difficult place at the moment. And my other piece of advice is for academics and historians is to beware of the culture war, because I think certain people are eager to ridicule academia and universities and historians and drag them into a culture war. And I think you need to be careful about not being put into a stupid debate with someone who doesn't know much on TV, and to have your academic arguments ridiculed by thick people.
Yeah, so not to be flattered by the camera then, because you, or the offer of taking part on camera, because you actually do take your seat in news studios, and you are very active on social media, and you place yourself in the middle of culture wars, just as some of our academic audience will do. You seem to do it. You do it by choice. They probably don't do it quite as much by choice as you do, Sathnam. But culture wars, they're in the trenches. You're in the trenches. You have taken the most enormous amount of abuse for a long period of time. I can't believe that that isn't wearing. How do you deal with that? How do you navigate that?
Well, I think firstly it's good to have people to support you. So I have now got a kind of a group of historians who back me up. And it is really difficult. I mean, to be honest, this year I'm doing almost no events because at every single event I do, someone stands up and shouts at me for 5 or 10 minutes, saying pretty much the same thing they always say about Empire being a great achievement and castigating me for criticising it. But you do get thick-skinned just with the sheer volume of it.
So when you say you do events and people actually stand up on the floor and shout at you, what happens with the rest of the people in the room? Do they defend you? Do they go quiet?
This is the thing. Actually, when someone does that, and they do it at almost every event, it actually energises the event because then people are booing, representatives of the town feel bad that this person has come and said these idiotic things. They think it's rude. I sell a lot of books, but actually I realise it's taking a toll on me. And I started to dread going to do events, and I've stopped doing them just for my mental health. And I think it's important to recognise that it can get to you. And actually praise also can get to you. Because I think each time you talk to someone, you're having to go over quite difficult issues. If you're talking about empire, you're talking about racism, you're talking about colonialism and misogyny and massacres. It's quite difficult stuff, even when people agree with you, and sometimes you need to take a break.
So for some of our audience, they won't be able to take a break because they'll be in universities and colleges and very much in the trenches of culture wars and identity politics and
cancel culture.
Yeah. And we have a young generation that is very vocal, thankfully, in my view, about what they think, about whatever they think. I'm pleased to see the younger generations actually talking about politics and making their views plain. But that's quite difficult. Cancel culture is a really difficult thing, especially for academics. Again, advice from you that that's been dealing with it for such a long time. Do you have any?
Well, I think cancel culture is wildly exaggerated. I don't think it really happens. Most of the people who are said to have been cancelled are still employed. They still have columns in right-wing newspapers. They're probably even more successful than ever. They've just been challenged by people who disagree with them. So I think the whole thing is wildly exaggerated. But I do think that academics don't do themselves any favours. Like, for example, I think the phrase white privilege is unnecessarily aggravating, because it implies that all white people are privileged, right? And actually, the even more difficult phrase is decolonisation. It's a phrase very popular amongst academics, but again, it's easy to ridicule. It creates the idea that the woke are trying to stop certain white authors from being studied. And for me, decolonisation is about widening the curriculum, and I feel like the word widening would be better. So I feel like academia doesn't do itself favours, and maybe it needs to recognise the ways in which it's going to be ridiculed.
So it's the language of academia, actually, that you're talking about in some ways, isn't it? Because decolonising the curriculum is a huge thing, and it has been for many years. And I think there are a few universities who are not quite rightly doing that, looking at what the books in their library and the texts that they keep, basically. So it's the language of academia that you're talking about, actually. Yeah,
and the tone. And I think you've got to recognise that people feel threatened and are very defensive. Don't give them a reason to become your enemy. I try to bring people along, but I realise that there's a lot of people listening to this who are going to say I'm a complete cop-out and, universities really need to be decolonised. And some people think, all museums need to be closed down and blah, blah, blah. And I don't believe that. I think there's a middle way.
There's a wonderful sequence in Empire State of Mind, isn't there, in Aberdeen, when they're doing exactly that. And that's I watched that sequence and I thought that is the most enormous amount of work that university is doing, but good on them. But just tell the audience about what actually they're doing with their collection, their museum collection in Aberdeen.
Yeah, I think Aberdeen University Museum is taking a very proactive approach to its colonial artifacts and repatriating them when necessary. I think they've got some Benin bronzes they're sending back, but they've also got, like almost all our museums, they've got human remains, which they're trying to respectfully return or bury or, have the correct religious rights over. Whereas the knee-jerk attitude of our national taxpayer-funded museums is to never return anything. And actually, I think there's laws that stops them from returning things. And it just goes to show you there's a lot actually positive stuff happening outside those main museums. Like there's nothing stopping regional museums and universities from repatriating things.
I thought that was, one of the, there was such a lot, there is such a lot in that series to think about, and there's such a lot that stays with you. And as a fellow Wolfrunian, there's a lot that stays with me about the city that I grew up in as well.
No one's going to know what Wolfrunian means.
Well, you know what it means, and I know what it means.
Yes.
And it's the correct term, isn't it?
It is, yeah, but no one knows.
No one knows what they do now.
Them.
Well, OK, we won't tell them. All right, people from Wolvesend, people from Wolverhampton. That's going to the grammar school, you see, as you did in Wolverhampton. I think that's where I know where the Wolfrunian comes from.
Yeah.
Because I think it was on a crest. Yeah. And the grammar school door of the school I went to, for no other reason than that. Do you think that Empire State of Mind had any impact on the broadcasting landscape or people that make television?
It's hard to tell, but I know stuff like that's very rare. TV audiences are very conservative, commissioners are very conservative. Empire has been a standard subject for history documentaries for decades, but it's only a certain argument that really gets aired. So it's Jeremy Paxman's series, Niall Ferguson's series, quite nostalgic about Empire, well, very nostalgic about Empire. And also we've got dozens and dozens of documentaries about the Indian Railways, where you have a man of a certain age in red trousers getting off a train, talking about the glory of the Indian Railways and how the British gave the Indians this gift. And the truth is, of course, the railways weren't built for the benefit of the Indians, they were built for the British. And they were exploitative, and thousands of Indians died making them, and they weren't a gift. But you cannot get that commissioned, that argument. I would love to make a series about the real story of the Indian Railways, but as one producer said to me, the problem in Sathnam, viewers don't like to have their prejudices challenged. TV is very conservative. To take on that massive nostalgia is a generation's work, and it's going to take more than me and David Olusoga to do it. And I feel like David is at the forefront of that, but it's slowly beginning to happen. And I don't understand why there aren't loads of programs like it, because I feel that colonialism is a massive subject that young people especially are fascinated with. And, I've been really surprised by the success of my book, and I feel that similar programs would be very successful, but it's going to take a long time. But,
the drive is for younger audiences. And
yeah, except young people don't watch terrestrial TV.
No, they're not as many as used to watch terrestrial television. So are you tempted to then make for the SVODs and different platforms?
I'd love to see a kind of a series on colonialism for Netflix. I don't understand, given how big a deal Black Lives Matter has been for all our broadcasters, that they haven't delved into this area. Although I have seen there's been a couple of ITV documentaries by black TV presenters that have been really good. But TV is very, very conservative. I mean, the average age of even Channel 4 viewer, I think, is in its late 60s, or at least the mid-60s. And so that producer's probably right. They don't want their prejudices challenged.
So if you're listening, Netflix, there's some very good ideas here, and somebody with more than the right capabilities to make them. And I was going to wrap up really by saying, OK, I'll give you any broadcasting platform or channel or SVOD you want, and enough money to make some really good shows. So what would they be? Other than the Indian Railways, we've just heard that. What else?
I'd love to do a series about the influence of empire upon the world. Again, there's been loads because of Paxman and Niall Ferguson, but the real influence, the political chaos caused by British Empire, the way in which empire shaped charities, the charity work we do across the planet, the way we turned nations into one-crop economies and created tea plantations, but the real story, not just the rose-tinted version.
Okay, so I really believe Netflix should be absolutely listening to this, and maybe Edinburgh will pass on some of those comments to Netflix. So is this where you're going now, or do you not know what your future holds, Sathnam? So you've done journalism and sort of dramatic personal narrative fiction and factual, although history is argument, in Empireland. What next? What next?
I've never had a clear ambition. All I try to do is to make sure my next project is something that scares me. Everything I've ever done, for my memoir, I began writing it thinking it was beyond me. When I felt the same about my novel, I definitely felt the same about Empireland, because I'm not a historian. I felt terrified, thought I was going to screw it up, and I want my next project to make me feel like that. So, we'll see.
Sathnam Sanghera, thank you so much. It's been an absolute joy.
Thank you, Lynn.